You're watching the legal breakdown. So, Glenn, we've spoken a few times over the last couple of weeks about an impending or potential indictment coming out of Fulton County against Trump. We now know that Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg has impaneled a grand jury over the issue of Trump's campaign paying hush money payouts to Stormy Daniels ahead of the 2016 campaign. So, can you give an overview of what's happening right now?
Yes, although let me start by saying I feel like this show is now in reruns. It feels like we've
Right.
been waiting forever
Yeah.
for District Attorney Alvin Bragg to make some kind of concrete progress toward criminal charges of Donald Trump. And it felt like we were getting closer, only to have Bragg previously kill an investigation into Donald Trump and decide to bring charges only against the Trump organization and Trump's chief financial officer, Alan Weisselberg. And of course, not too long ago, the Trump organization went to trial and was criminally convicted of a 15-year-long criminal scheme to defraud, essentially a tax fraud scheme. And Donald Trump was nowhere in the mix. So I think we were all taken by surprise when all of a sudden we learned, courtesy of the New York Times, that DA Bragg has now impaneled a special grand jury to look into some of Donald Trump's New York state crimes. Now, a special grand jury, which we've heard a lot about in connection with the Georgia election probe, it's different in New York. A special grand jury basically just means that it will sit for 6 months rather than a regular grand jury, which would sit for 30 days in the state of New York. So here is an overview of the crimes that we are now told DA Bragg is investigating. And I will say you'll hear the skepticism in my voice throughout, but he has impaneled the grand jury. He is actively presenting witnesses. He has met with Michael Cohen, and the reports suggest that Michael Cohen will be going into the grand jury in the near future. So I think what we can glean from that is at least Bragg is legitimately investigating these crimes. What are these crimes? This is the $130,000 hush money payment to porn star Stormy Daniels. We could do a quick recap. In the run-up to the 2016 election, Donald Trump decided he wanted to hide, he wanted to bury, he wanted to secrete from the American voters the fact that he had had an affair with a porn star, Stormy Daniels. So in a conspiracy with Michael Cohen, his former lawyer, he decided that he would pay Stormy Daniels $130,000 to keep her mouth shut. Michael Cohen then went about implementing this crime, this conspiracy, and made the $130,000 payment to Stormy Daniels. And then Donald Trump wrote, I think it was a dozen reimbursement checks to Michael Cohen, 35 grand a pop, to reimburse him. Now, first of all, when you're paying off people to keep information hidden from the American public, the American voters during your campaign, that would be a campaign finance violation. We've come to learn that there were also any number of other crimes in violation of New York state law, falsifying business records, falsifying records to cover up campaign finance crimes under New York state law, tax fraud. So it looks like Donald Trump is now being investigated for all of those possible crimes. And of course, Michael Cohen, Brian, as a result of participating in this scheme, in this conspiracy to which he pleaded guilty and went to prison, he goes to prison while Donald Trump ambles into the White House and starts writing Michael Cohen reimbursement checks out of the White House. So this criminal scheme carried over while Donald Trump was president because he kept making these reimbursement payments to Michael Cohen. So now here we are. That is being investigated again, and it's anybody's guess as to whether it will actually come to fruition with criminal indictments of Donald Trump.
So obviously a lot of questions here, but the most important one is that if Michael Cohen pleaded guilty to campaign finance charges related to this issue, and that was enough to send him to prison, how is it not a sure thing that the guy responsible for the exact same issue wouldn't also go to prison?
So first of all, nothing's a sure thing, because it's one thing for Michael Cohen to stand up in court and plead guilty and accept responsibility for what he did. But it's a very different thing to go to trial, sponsoring the testimony of Michael Cohen and try to use it in part to prove Donald Trump guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, because Michael Cohen will be what I would call an ugly witness, because he told all kinds of lies. He committed all kinds of crimes for years, albeit with and at the direction of Donald Trump. But that doesn't necessarily make him an instantly appealing and credible witness. But of course, he's only one of the witnesses. And I think one of the other questions is, why now? Because they just had a big old criminal trial to convict the Trump organization of lots of crimes. Of course, Donald Trump could have been rolled into that trial as a defendant, but he wasn't. Why now? And I think there are a number of possible factors as to why Alvin Bragg picked now to jumpstart this criminal investigation. First of all, because they just went through a big old criminal trial of the Trump organization, I have a feeling that shook the criminal tree of Trump org, and maybe some evidence fell out that tended to incriminate Donald Trump. That's one reason Alvin Bragg might be jumpstarting this probe. Another reason is there are a number of witnesses who testified at the Trump org trial who were former members of the Trump org. The prosecutors got to kick the tires of those witnesses, see how they performed when the stakes weren't quite so high. I mean, the stakes were high. They were trying the Trump organization for crimes, but it's not like they were trying a former president of the United States for crimes. So those witnesses performed. The prosecutors got to see how they withstood cross-examination from the defense attorneys representing Trump org, and maybe they were pleased with the performance of those witnesses. And the prosecutors might know some of those same witnesses would have to be used in a trial against Donald Trump himself. A third reason is, recently Donald Trump's tax returns were released first to Congress and then publicly. And guess what? Some of what we now know is the $130,000 hush money payment. Donald Trump wrote it off as business expenses. They ain't business expenses. They're part of a criminal course of conduct. So he also committed tax fraud, not only tax fraud under the laws of the state of New York, but federal tax fraud. Of course, it would take a federal prosecution to bring those charges, but it may also be that the revelations the New York prosecutors learned about Donald Trump's taxes based on the release of his tax returns also fueled Bragg's decision to jumpstart this investigation. And let me just throw a fourth one into the mix, and then I'll stop because I tend to ramble. The fourth one is, we all know that another district attorney, another state district attorney, Fani Willis down in Georgia, looks like she may make some charging decisions about Donald Trump imminently. That's her word. She just used that word in open court. And I think this would be an ugly factor if, in fact, it's a factor. But you know what? Maybe Alvin Bragg is starting to feel the heat, and, he doesn't want to be upstaged by another state district attorney who's got the goods on Trump and isn't afraid to use them. And so now maybe Alvin Bragg is feeling like, I better get off the dime and investigate and perhaps indict just some of the New York state crimes Donald Trump has committed.
Yeah. And that last one is something that I had thought about as well. Just on this issue of the campaign finance, legal issues that we're looking at right now. Is this not the FEC that would investigate something like that? And also, just as a follow-up to that question, if it is the FEC, does the FEC have any enforcement ability, even if they did find some wrongdoing?
So the prosecution would be conducted at the end of the day by the Department of Justice, by the criminal prosecutors at the DOJ. So there are similar examples, like the IRS has some criminal fraud tax investigators, but the IRS can't prosecute anybody. The FEC can't prosecute anybody. Ultimately, they can conduct enforcement investigations, try to determine what happened, but any criminal prosecutions would then be referred to the Department of Justice, and that's where the cases would get prosecuted. Of course, that is only for federal campaign finance violations. You can also have violations of New York state law if you fraudulently try to cover up campaign finance violations that would violate New York state law. So a lot of this conduct will violate both federal law and state law. So both jurisdictions, both sovereigns would have an interest in and an ability to prosecute Donald Trump for the violations of the different laws.
And so would it be possible, like, is there a world in which we can see Trump tried for these campaign finance violations in both New York and at the federal level?
Absolutely. And even more so than the campaign finance violations, because remember, the federal government has brought some pretty challenging campaign finance fraud cases, like against John Edwards years ago, and they didn't win those cases. And I feel like they got stung a little bit, and maybe that makes them a little hesitant to bring cases again against sort of high value political targets. But I think the more likely federal charges that we might see arising out of the crimes that Donald Trump committed together with Michael Cohen, these hush money payoff crimes, are tax violations, because those crimes, proving those, kind of like shooting fish in a barrel when you're violating the law by making hush money payments to bury, deeply damaging information from the American voters. And then you're lying about it and you're fraudulently making entries on your federal tax forms. Those are easy prosecutions to bring. So if federal charges are to be brought out of this incident, I would suspect the more likely candidate would be federal tax fraud.
So is the point of this special grand jury that's being impaneled right now by Alvin Bragg, is the point of that to deliver a report similar to what's happening in Fulton County, to deliver a report to Alvin Bragg, and then he'll decide based on that report whether he wants to move forward with charges against Trump or not? Is that correct?
No, this is where New York grand jury procedures differ from Georgia state grand jury procedures. My understanding, I was never a practitioner in New York, even though I was born in Brooklyn. I escaped to New Jersey early on. I didn't escape far. But my understanding is the only difference in New York between a regular grand jury and a special grand jury is the length of time they sit to hear the case. Regular grand juries sit for 30 days and then they expire. So they basically conduct investigations that are of smaller crimes, more finite crimes. And a special grand jury is impaneled when the prosecutors believe they need a long-term grand jury to fully investigate and flesh everything out, get all the evidence before that grand jury, and then they can ask for indictments from that special grand jury in New York.
So with that special grand jury, is it up to Alvin Bragg or is it up to the special grand jury themselves? Who's going to make that decision as to whether they move forward with an indictment or not?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's kind of a hybrid decision, actually. We've all heard the ugly saying that a prosecutor can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich. I always bristle when I hear that because in my experience before grand juries for decades, they wanted their evidence. They wanted evidence that proved by probable cause that somebody committed a crime and that the evidence proves the identity of the perpetrator before they're going to be willing to indict. Sometimes grand juries will disagree with a prosecutor's decision and they will return what's called a no bill. They will vote not to indict, as opposed to a true bill, which is a vote to indict. So the prosecutor asks the grand jury to indict and recommends certain charges that the prosecutor believes are supported by the evidence that's been developed in the grand jury. But it is ultimately the grand jury's decision. A prosecutor cannot force a grand jury to indict. They make the request, they make their best arguments, they highlight the evidence that supports an indictment, and then they ask the grand jury to vote out an indictment. I will say, ordinarily, Brian, grand juries go with the prosecutor's recommendation because the evidence is there.
So let's say that we do see a recommendation for an indictment from the grand jury. What's the timeline of what happens next?
So what will happen is Donald Trump will make his first court appearance. It's called an arraignment. He will be informed of the charges that the grand jury has leveled against him. And then there will be a series of court dates set, status hearings. There will be motions hearings in the run up to trial, and ultimately there will be a trial date. I think a good rule of thumb time-wise is from the moment he makes his first court appearance, trials typically are held within 6 months to a year of that first court appearance. But of course, defense attorneys will always try to get continuances and push it off into the future. Prosecutors will generally fight continuances because they want to try a case while, the recollection of witnesses are fresh. But I think 6 months to a year is a good rule of thumb with respect to when we can expect to see a trial of Donald Trump after he makes his first court appearance.
Okay, got it. And Now, what is the range of punishments for Trump in this scenario, from slap on the wrist to the most severe?
So I know the New York Times piece reported that he's facing 4 years. I think that's on one of the counts. It really depends on how many charges the prosecutors believe the evidence shows should be indicted, because there's, a fraud, creating false business records in violation of New York state law. There's tax fraud in violation of New York state law. There's falsifying records to cover up campaign finance violations of New York state law. There's also a conspiracy charge that could be brought because, based on what we know, Donald Trump was undoubtedly in a conspiracy with Donald Trump and perhaps others, perhaps Alan Weisselberg, perhaps David Pecker, the head of the National Enquirer, who there has been some reporting was involved in this scheme to pay off Stormy Daniels. So it's impossible at this stage to say what kind of punishment, what kind of prison time is he facing until we see precisely what charges the grand jury decides to bring, if any.
I know that you don't like to do predictions, that you're not in the betting business here, but if you had to guess, like even prior to actually seeing what the charges in front of us are going to be, if you had to guess what we would most likely see in this case in terms of punishments, what would you imagine that it would be?
I think the punishment by way of prison time would be very modest. Listen, 1 day at Rikers is too long.
Yeah.
But when I say modest, if Donald Trump goes to trial, if he's convicted, I would think he's looking at something like 6 months to a year by way of a sentence. But I think all bets are off when it comes to the rules of convention when you're dealing with a former president.
Yeah.
I could see even a 1 year prison term being converted into home detention for somebody like a former president of the United States, which I will say sends the exact wrong signal and message. But I just don't know if prosecutors have the appetite to actually put a former president in prison. I sure hope that between Alvin Bragg, Fani Willis, the Department of Justice, and any other prosecutors who might be looking at crimes Donald Trump committed in their jurisdictions, I sure hope they do have the appetite to put him in prison, because that will deter tomorrow's wannabe dictator.
And just as one final question, what happens if there are competing sentences in competing jurisdictions? Like if we see some sentence handed down in Fulton County, then we see something from the Manhattan DA's office, like where does he get pulled to? Who takes priority here?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was a federal prosecutor in D.C., I would sometimes have a defendant who was convicted in one of my cases who was also facing a sentence in, for example, Virginia or Maryland across the river. And then what ordinarily the rule is, wherever you are first convicted and wherever you are first sentenced to prison time, that's where you will begin serving your sentence. But let me hasten to add, jurisdictions will frequently cooperate. The Federal Bureau of Prisons, which has responsibility for all defendants who are convicted in federal cases, will often sort of take the lead and will coordinate with state jurisdictions to try to come up with some kind of a consensus plan as to where the inmate should serve his or her sentence. So, rule of thumb is the first jurisdiction to sentence somebody to prison typically confines that person, and then subsequent sentences will be served thereafter. But again, all bets are off when it comes to a former president, and I think you'll see quite a bit of cooperation among different jurisdictions.
Great. Well, a lot to continue looking out for, especially on this issue. For anybody watching, if you want to keep up with legal news, make sure to subscribe to both my channel and Glenn's channel. The links are right here on the screen. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.